Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera was born on April 4, 1957, in the rugged hills of La Tuna, a tiny village in the municipality of Badiraguato, Sinaloa, Mexico. This region, tucked deep within the Sierra Madre Mountains, has long been notorious as a cradle for Mexico's drug trade. It was an unforgiving place where poverty shaped every aspect of life and where opportunity was scarce. Families survived on subsistence farming, and young men often turned to cultivating opium poppies or marijuana, not out of greed, but out of necessity. For Joaquín Guzmán, later known as El Chapo, or Shorty, this environment planted the seeds of the path he would eventually take. He grew up in a poor farming family. His father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos, was a cattle rancher, but also rumored to be involved in cultivating opium poppies, which were already part of the local economy. His mother, Maria Consuelo Loera Pierres, tried to keep the household together, raising Joaquín along with his siblings in harsh conditions. The family lived in a modest home with little food and few comforts. From an early age, Joaquín learned the meaning of hunger and survival. By the time he was just a boy, he was already working in the fields, helping to grow beans, corn, and poppies. Joaquín's education was minimal. He attended school only through the 3rd grade before dropping out to work full-time and support his family. The isolation of the mountains meant that there were few prospects beyond farming or migrating. Like many boys in the region, Joaquín was small but tough, developing a reputation for being resourceful, determined, and quick thinking. His nickname, El Chapo, came from his short stature. He would never grow taller than 5'6", but his small size masked a growing ambition that would later define him. During his teenage years, Guzmán began selling oranges and soft drinks on the roadside to earn extra money. He often clashed with his abusive father, who would reportedly spend what little income the family made on alcohol. As a result, Joaquín grew close to his mother, who provided him with the emotional support his father never gave. But even under his mother's care, he could not escape the harsh reality that life in Sinaloa revolved around one thing: the drug trade. Farmers had long discovered that cultivating marijuana and opium poppies yielded far more money than corn or beans. For many, it was the only way to escape poverty. And for Guzmán, the drug economy soon became a doorway into something much larger. By the 1970s, as Guzmán entered his late teens and early 20s, Mexico was becoming a critical supplier of narcotics to the United States. The demand for marijuana, heroin, and later cocaine was surging across the border, and traffickers in Sinaloa were reaping the benefits. Guzmán started small, working alongside his cousins and uncles, cultivating marijuana and opium, and transporting it on mules through the rugged terrain. He showed a sharp business sense early on, quickly realizing that speed, secrecy, and loyalty were essential for survival in the drug world. People in his village noticed that despite his size, Joaquín was fearless and willing to take risks. He was known for being ruthless when it came to protecting his territory and shipments, but also generous to locals, sharing money, and helping poor families. This combination of toughness and cunning made him stand out among other young men in the region. Slowly, he began to rise from a small, time farmer and smuggler to someone with greater ambition. The 1970s were also a time when the Guadalajara Cartel, led by Miguel Angel F.A. Gallardo, was consolidating power in Mexico. This cartel, based in western Mexico, was one of the first major drug syndicates to coordinate large-scale trafficking operations. It was through contacts in Sinaloa that Joaquín eventually came under the wing of the Guadalajara Cartel. Before he officially worked for Gallardo, he had already earned a reputation as a skilled logistics operator, someone who could ensure that drugs moved safely through difficult routes. His knowledge of the mountains and the communities within them made him invaluable. But long before becoming a major figure in organized crime, El Chapo's early years were marked by struggle. He often told stories later in life of how he sold oranges and candy in the streets, of how he had to drop out of school to help feed his family, and of how his father's neglect shaped him into someone who would never accept weakness. These childhood experiences gave him a relentless drive to succeed, no matter the cost. Poverty, abuse, and the drug-soaked environment of Badiraguato combined to mold a boy who would one day become the world's most infamous drug lord. By his early 20s, Guzmán was already trusted with small but important tasks within the drug trade. He organized local growers, arranged shipments, and learned how to bribe police and local officials to look the other way. He also gained a reputation for discipline. If shipments were late or if people stole from him, he dealt with it swiftly and brutally. His associates began calling him a reliable operator, someone who could be counted on when others failed. This reputation would prove to be the foundation of his rise. What set Joaquín apart was not just his willingness to use violence, but his ability to think strategically. Even in his youth, he understood that moving drugs required innovation. The rugged terrain of Sinaloa was both a blessing and a curse. Difficult for authorities to penetrate, but also difficult for traffickers to navigate. Guzmán began experimenting with creative ways of transporting drugs, methods that would later earn him the title, the Tunnel Master. But in these early days, it was about mules, hidden compartments, and building trustworthy networks. By the late 1970s, Guzmán's ambitions had outgrown La Tuna. He knew that to climb higher, he needed to align himself with bigger players. Through his connections, he began working more closely with drug lords linked to the Guadalajara Cartel. This marked the end of his days as a small-time smuggler and the beginning of his career as a rising figure in Mexico's organized crime syndicates. The boy from the mountains was on his way to becoming something much greater. The seeds had been planted: poverty, ambition, resourcefulness, and the lure of the drug trade. Joaquín's Loera had survived a brutal childhood, and now he was ready to step onto a larger stage. His story was no longer just about survival. It was about power, money, and the relentless pursuit of becoming one of the most powerful men in the world. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Joaquín Guzmán Lora had already made a name for himself in the rugged mountains of Sinaloa as a disciplined smuggler. But small-scale cultivation and mule transport could only take him so far. To rise beyond the dusty fields of La Tuna, he needed to attach himself to men who controlled not just fields and villages, but entire territories. This opportunity came when Guzmán found his way into the inner circles of Mexico's most powerful cartel of that era, the Guadalajara Cartel. The Guadalajara Cartel was led by Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, a former police officer turned drug lord who became known as El Padrino, or the Godfather. Under his leadership, the cartel grew into a powerful organization that coordinated drug routes from South America through Mexico and into the United States. In a time before the Colombian Medellin and Cali cartels had fully taken control of the cocaine trade, Gallardo and his associates were laying the groundwork for a massive narco empire. They were sophisticated, ruthless, and connected to politicians, police commanders, and even intelligence agencies. For an ambitious young man like Guzmán, working under Gallardo meant stepping into the big leagues. Guzmán began his apprenticeship as a logistics operator under one of Gallardo's most trusted lieutenants, H. Ater Luis Palma Salazar, known as El Guerrero Palma. Palma recognized Guzmán's discipline and organizational skills. Together, they began moving larger shipments of marijuana and cocaine. Guzmán was put in charge of making sure loads departed on time, arrived safely, and were paid for in full. It was a simple formula. If a shipment was late or lost, someone paid the price. Guzmán quickly developed a reputation for enforcing punctuality with an iron hand. Traffickers who missed deadlines would face harsh consequences, sometimes even death. In the brutal world of narco trafficking, efficiency and reliability meant survival, and Guzmán embodied both. By this time, Colombia had become the world's main producer of cocaine, and Mexican traffickers were increasingly partnering with Colombian cartels to transport the drug into the United States. The Guadalajara Cartel became the essential middleman, using its knowledge of terrain and corrupt networks to smuggle vast quantities northward. Guzmán learned the trade from the inside, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to coordinate smuggling routes, and how to bribe officials on both sides of the border. The scale of operations was unlike anything he had experienced in La Tuna. Instead of mules carrying small loads across mountain paths, he was now overseeing truckloads, airplanes, and eventually the first experiments with underground tunnels. Guzmán also learned another lesson. Survival in the drug world required more than just logistics. It required absolute loyalty and cunning. Gallardo's organization was filled with ambitious lieutenants, each hungry for power. Betrayals and assassinations were constant risks. Guzmán, however, proved himself trustworthy and valuable. He stayed disciplined, never challenging his superiors directly, but quietly absorbing every lesson about how the cartel world worked. At the same time, he began to build his own loyal crew, men from his hometown and surrounding villages who would protect him no matter what. This crew would later form the backbone of his power. During the early 1980s, Guzmán's operations became increasingly sophisticated. One of his trademarks was using hidden compartments in trucks to move drugs across the border. He understood that innovation could mean the difference between success and prison. He experimented with aircraft drop, using small planes to scatter loads in isolated fields for pickup. But what made him stand out most was his obsession with tunnels. While still under the Guadalajara Cartel, Guzmán pushed for building secret underground passages along the U.S.-Mexico border, allowing traffickers to move shipments beneath checkpoints. This innovation would later earn him worldwide notoriety as the Tunnel Master. But while Guzmán was learning and rising, the Guadalajara Cartel was also heading toward turmoil. In 1985, the cartel made a fatal mistake: the kidnapping, torture, and murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. Camarena had been investigating the cartel's operations and had come dangerously close to exposing its massive marijuana plantations. His brutal murder brought enormous pressure from the United States. Suddenly, the Mexican government, which had long tolerated and even collaborated with traffickers, was forced to act. Authorities began arresting cartel leaders, and the once unified Guadalajara Cartel started to splinter. This was a pivotal moment for Guzmán. With Gallardo's arrest in 1989, the old cartel structure collapsed. The empire that had once dominated Mexico fractured into smaller, competing organizations. Power was suddenly up for grabs. Out of the ashes of Guadalajara, three major cartels emerged: the Tijuana Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, and the Sinaloa Cartel. It was within this chaos that Guzmán seized his chance. Alongside H. Hector Luis Palma and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, he became one of the founding leaders of the Sinaloa Cartel, the organization that would eventually dominate the global drug trade. But before Guzmán could reach that position, he had to survive the Cartel Wars that followed Gallardo's downfall. During this time, Guzmán's reputation as a violent but effective leader grew. He learned to balance diplomacy with brutality. He struck alliances when useful, but he also used extreme violence to eliminate rivals. Those who underestimated him often paid with their lives. Unlike some cartel leaders who flaunted wealth and power, Guzmán preferred to keep a lower profile, focusing on logistics and expansion rather than public image. This humility, combined with his ruthlessness, made him an effective and dangerous leader. The years under the Guadalajara cartel were crucial in shaping El Chapo. He entered as a small-town smuggler and emerged as a seasoned operator with knowledge of international trafficking, corruption networks, and cartel politics. He saw firsthand how power could crumble when leaders became too confident or too visible. He also saw how corruption, carefully managed, could turn the state itself into a partner rather than an enemy. These lessons would guide him throughout his career, allowing him to survive where others fell. By the end of the 1980s, Joaquín Guzmán Lora was no longer just a disciplined apprentice. He was a rising figure in his own right, preparing to carve out a place at the top of Mexico's criminal hierarchy. The fall of the Guadalajara cartel had created a power vacuum, and Guzmán was ready to fill it. The boy from La Tuna had studied under one of Mexico's most powerful drug lords, and now he was about to become a kingpin himself. The apprenticeship was over. The empire of El Chapo was about to begin. The year was 1989, and the Mexican underworld stood at a crossroads. The once mighty Guadalajara cartel had shattered after the arrest of its leader, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. What had seemed like an untouchable empire collapsed almost overnight, leaving behind a void filled with violence, betrayal, and opportunity. In the chaos that followed, new cartels emerged, each determined to claim its share of the lucrative cocaine and marijuana trade. It was within this turbulent landscape that Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán began constructing the organization that would one day dominate the global drug trade, the Sinaloa Cartel. El Chapo was not alone in this endeavor. Alongside him were Hector Luis Palma Salazar, known as El Goro Palma, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a trafficker with deep connections and a reputation for cunning diplomacy. Together, they formed the backbone of the Sinaloa Cartel, a group that drew heavily from their home state of Sinaloa, a place where drug cultivation was not just business, but part of the culture. Their mission was simple, but dangerous: to outsmart rivals, outmaneuver authorities, and take control of Mexico's trafficking routes. At its inception, the Sinaloa Cartel was smaller and less organized than its rivals. The Tijuana Cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers, controlled the key border city of Tijuana, giving them a direct and highly profitable gateway into California. The Juarez Cartel, under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, commanded fleets of aircraft to smuggle cocaine on an industrial scale. Against such formidable opponents, El Chapo and his partners needed a strategy that set them apart. That strategy would become their signature: innovation, persistence, and the ruthless elimination of anyone who stood in their way. El Chapo's role within the Sinaloa Cartel was clear from the start. He was the master of logistics, the man who could move shipments through impossible routes, who could design systems so efficient that rivals could only envy them. He envisioned the cartel not just as a gang of traffickers, but as a multinational business with its own infrastructure. Under his guidance, the Sinaloa Cartel began investing in advanced smuggling techniques. Trucks were outfitted with sophisticated hidden compartments. Planes dropped shipments in isolated fields under precise coordination. Most famously, tunnels became an essential tool for Guzmán. The ground beneath the border was a highway waiting to be built. The first tunnels were crude, dug by hand, and reinforced with wooden planks. But even in their early stages, they proved invaluable, allowing tons of cocaine to pass beneath U.S. checkpoints without detection. Over time, these tunnels became more elaborate, equipped with lighting, ventilation, and rail tracks to move drugs quickly and quietly. The innovation gave Sinaloa a competitive edge. Where rivals relied on brute force and bribery, Guzmán relied on creativity and engineering. But the cartel's rise was not built on logistics alone. It was also carved in blood. The early 1990s saw a wave of violence across Mexico as cartels battled for territory. The Sinaloa Cartel clashed frequently with the Tuna Cartel, whose leaders, the Arellano F.A. Lix brothers, were known for their ruthlessness. Shootouts erupted in border cities, assassinations shook rival organizations, and civilians often became collateral damage. In 1993, this violent rivalry would explode into one of the most infamous incidents in Mexican history: the murder of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo in Guadalajara, a killing that shocked the nation and brought intense pressure on Guzmán. But before that fateful event, Guzmán was already making his mark as a feared and ambitious leader. Despite the bloodshed, Guzmán understood the importance of building networks beyond the battlefield. He forged alliances with Colombian cartels, ensuring a steady supply of cocaine. He bribed politicians, military officers, and police commanders, creating a protective shield around his operations. The Mexican state, riddled with corruption, often looked the other way or even assisted in exchange for money. Guzmán mastered the art of corruption, turning it into a weapon as powerful as any gun. For every rival who threatened him with bullets, Guzmán could neutralize another with a suitcase full of cash. As the Sinaloa Cartel expanded, so too did Guzmán's wealth and influence. By the early 1990s, he was a millionaire many times over, living in luxury while simultaneously maintaining a Robin Hood-like reputation in rural communities. In Sinaloa, stories circulated of El Chapo paying for medicine, building roads, or handing out money to the poor. These tales, whether exaggerated or true, cemented his image as both a feared criminal and a folk hero. To the poor, he was someone who had risen from the same struggles they faced, someone who shared his wealth, even if it was stained with blood. But El Chapo's ambitions extended far beyond Sinaloa. He envisioned an empire that stretched across Mexico and into the United States, Europe, and Asia. To achieve this, he needed discipline, innovation, and a willingness to act decisively. If a rival stood in his way, he removed them. If a politician demanded too much money, he replaced them with someone more cooperative. If a smuggling route became too dangerous, he created a new one. This adaptability became a hallmark of the Sinaloa Cartel and a key reason for its eventual dominance. The 1990s also marked the beginning of El Chapo's life on the run. As his notoriety grew, so too did the attention of law enforcement. Mexican authorities, under pressure from the United States, began targeting him more aggressively. But Guzmán proved elusive. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, moved constantly between safe houses, and used elaborate escape routes, including tunnels built beneath his own homes. His paranoia, though extreme, kept him alive in a world where betrayal was as common as loyalty. By the mid-1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel had established itself as one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Though still challenged by rivals in Tijuana and Juarez, it had carved out a significant share of the cocaine trade and developed smuggling methods that were the envy of the underworld. At its heart was El Chapo, the logistics genius who had risen from poverty to become a kingpin. He was no longer an apprentice, no longer just a loyal operator. He was now the architect of a criminal empire that would soon extend across continents. The construction of the Sinaloa Cartel was not just about drugs. It was about power. El Chapo had built an organization that could rival governments, influence economies, and terrorize entire cities. Yet for all his cunning and innovation, he could not escape the brutal truth of his world. Every rise invited a fall, and in the years ahead, El Chapo's growing empire would face challenges that threatened not just his power, but his very survival. The legend of El Chapo had begun, but the battles that would define him were only just ahead. From the very beginning of his career, Joaquín y El Chapo, Guzmán Loera understood that the difference between success and failure in the drug trade was logistics. Anyone could grow marijuana or move small amounts of cocaine, but smuggling tons of narcotics across one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world required imagination. Where his rivals relied on bribery or brute force, Guzmán relied on creativity. It was this obsession with innovation that would earn him the nickname that followed him across the globe, the Tunnel Master. The idea of using tunnels to transport contraband was not entirely new. Small passages had been dug before along the U.S.-Mexico border, but none on the scale or sophistication that Guzmán envisioned. For him, tunnels were not crude holes in the ground. They were highways of the underground, arteries that could move massive shipments directly beneath the noses of American Border Patrol. The brilliance lay in their simplicity. While authorities focused on checkpoints, vehicles, and airplanes, Guzmán's product traveled quietly below, unseen and unstoppable. In the early 1990s, under Guzmán's direction, the Sinaloa Cartel began constructing tunnels along key stretches of the border, particularly in Tijuana and later in Arizona and California. At first, they were basic, dug with shovels and reinforced with wooden planks. But as profits surged, so did investment in engineering. The tunnels soon became elaborate works of criminal architecture, equipped with ventilation systems, electricity, and even rail tracks to move carts loaded with cocaine and marijuana. One tunnel discovered years later stretched more than 500 feet, with hydraulic doors disguised under concrete floors. It was as if Guzmán had turned smuggling into an underground science. The tunnels were only one piece of his logistical genius. Guzmán diversified smuggling methods, ensuring that if one route failed, another would succeed. Trailers with hidden compartments carried shipments across checkpoints. Cargo ships moved tons of cocaine disguised as commercial goods. Aircraft were used to drop packages into remote fields, where trusted crews retrieved them under cover of night. In Colombia, alliances with the Medellin and Cali cartels guaranteed supply, while in Mexico, Guzmán's network of bribed officials guaranteed safe passage. If money was the lifeblood of the cartel, innovation was its beating heart. But tunnels became the symbol of his ingenuity, and they gave him a decisive edge over his rivals. While the Tijuana cartel fought bloody battles to control border crossings, Guzmán simply went under them. While the Juarez cartel relied on fleets of airplanes, Guzmán quietly built invisible pathways no radar could detect. This strategy allowed the Sinaloa Cartel to steadily expand, establishing itself not just as a competitor, but as a dominant force. For every ton of drugs intercepted by authorities, many more slipped undetected through the earth. Innovation, however, came with a price. Building such tunnels required money, manpower, and secrecy. Engineers, construction crews, and workers had to be paid and silenced. Authorities occasionally uncovered tunnels, sparking media outrage and political embarrassment. But for Guzmán, discovery was only a temporary setback. For every tunnel shut down, another was already being dug. His relentless drive to stay one step ahead of law enforcement became legendary. As one U.S. official later remarked, "When you think you've closed all the doors on El Chapo, he just digs a new one." Guzmán's obsession with logistics was also reflected in his approach to discipline. Within the Sinaloa Cartel, shipments were timed with precision. If a driver was late or careless, punishment was swift and often brutal. Associates recalled that Guzmán valued punctuality above all else. To him, drugs were not just contraband, they were commodities, part of a supply chain that had to run flawlessly. This almost business-like approach set him apart from other traffickers, many of whom were consumed by violence or ego. Guzmán, despite his ruthless streak, saw himself as a businessman first, a criminal second. The United States soon recognized the tunnels as a hallmark of El Chapo's empire. In the early 1990s, when authorities discovered one of his first large tunnels near Agua Prieta, Sonora, it was described as a shocking revelation. Equipped with lighting and air systems, the tunnel stretched hundreds of feet under the border into Douglas, Arizona. For investigators, it was evidence of unprecedented sophistication. For Guzmán, it was proof that his strategy worked. The tunnels were not just smuggling tools. They were symbols of his defiance against the most powerful country in the world. Beyond tunnels, Guzmán also invested in another form of logistics. People. He understood that bribery was as essential as engineering. Police commanders, soldiers, and customs officers were placed on his payroll. Politicians received campaign funds in exchange for silence or cooperation. Judges and prosecutors were offered wealth or threatened with death. In Mexico, the term plata o plomo, silver or lead, described the choice officials faced to accept a bribe or risk a bullet. Guzmán wielded this principle with ruthless efficiency. His tunnels may have bypassed physical barriers, but corruption bypassed legal ones. What made Guzmán especially dangerous was his adaptability. When Colombian cartels faced crackdowns in the 1990s, Guzmán seized the opportunity to take on more responsibility for transporting cocaine into the United States. Instead of merely acting as a courier, the Sinaloa Cartel became a partner, demanding a larger share of profits. This shift, enabled by his smuggling networks, transformed the cartel into a global powerhouse. By the mid-1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel controlled a significant portion of cocaine entering the United States, generating billions of dollars annually. Tunnels, trucks, ships, and planes all formed part of a machine built for one purpose: to feed America's insatiable appetite for drugs. But innovation could not shield Guzmán from the growing storm. His tunnels had made him infamous, his cartel had made him powerful, and his reputation as a logistics genius had made him feared. Yet with notoriety came pressure. Rival cartels saw him as a threat, while U.S. and Mexican authorities saw him as a target. The murder of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posada Ocampo in 1993, believed to have been the result of a botched attempt to kill Guzmán, placed him at the center of international outrage. Suddenly, the tunnel master was no longer just a shadowy smuggler. He was public enemy number one. The very genius that built his empire would now draw the eyes of the world. His tunnels symbolized both his brilliance and his audacity, but they also marked him as a man who had declared war on borders, governments, and the law itself. For Joaquín Guzmán, the path forward would not only be underground. It would be soaked in blood, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of survival. The tunnel master had built his empire, but now he would have to defend it. By the early 1990s, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán Lora stood at the head of a rising cartel that was quickly carving out its place in Mexico's criminal underworld. The Sinaloa Cartel, though smaller than some of its rivals, had already distinguished itself through innovation, discipline, and the ingenuity of its tunnels. But power in the world of narco trafficking never came without a price. The road ahead for Guzmán was one of violence, bloodshed, and betrayal. A road where alliances could crumble overnight and trust was as fragile as glass. The greatest threat to Guzmán's growing empire came from rival cartels. Chief among them was the Tijuana Cartel, led by the Arellano F.A. Licks brothers. Based in Baja California, the Arellanos controlled the crucial border crossing into San Diego, one of the most profitable smuggling corridors into the United States. The brothers were notorious for their brutality. They used violence as a weapon not only against rivals, but also against civilians, often leaving a trail of bodies as a message of their dominance. For El Chapo, the Arellanos represented both an obstacle and an opportunity. If he could take control of their routes, his cartel would gain access to immense profits. But challenging them meant war. The rivalry between the Sinaloa and Tijuana cartels exploded into open conflict. Cities like Tijuana, Mexicali, and Guadalajara became battlegrounds. Assassinations were ordered on both sides, and shootouts erupted in public spaces, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire. Guzmán, though ruthless, tried to maintain an image of discipline compared to the flamboyant violence of the Arellanos. But when provoked, he struck with precision and fury. The war between Sinaloa and Tijuana would leave hundreds dead and set the stage for one of the most infamous incidents in Mexican history. In May 1993, Guzmán became the target of an assassination attempt at the Guadalajara International Airport. The Arellano F.A. Licks brothers had received intelligence that Guzmán would be traveling that day, and they sent a hit squad to intercept him. Gunmen armed with assault rifles opened fire near the airport's parking lot, sparking a chaotic shootout in broad daylight. But in the confusion, tragedy struck. Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, a respected Catholic leader, was killed in the crossfire. His murder shocked Mexico. For many citizens, it was unthinkable that a man of the church could be gunned down so brazenly. The killing turned Guzmán into a national villain overnight, whether he was directly responsible or merely a target. The government now had no choice but to act. The fallout was immediate. Under immense pressure from the Catholic Church, the Mexican government, and the United States, authorities launched an all-out manhunt for El Chapo. Guzmán, once a shadowy figure working behind the scenes, was now the face of cartel violence in Mexico. The murder of the cardinal exposed the extent of narco power, showing the public that not even religious leaders were safe. Guzmán fled, moving constantly between safe houses, protected by loyal bodyguards and corrupt officials. But the net was tightening. While rivals tried to kill him and authorities hunted him, Guzmán also faced betrayal from within. The world of drug trafficking was built on fragile alliances, and loyalty was often dictated by profit. Hector Luis Palma, once his trusted ally, was arrested in 1995 after a plane crash exposed his operations. Other lieutenants defected, either turning themselves in for reduced sentences or joining rival cartels. Each betrayal tested Guzmán's ability to maintain control. Yet each time, he responded with ruthless efficiency. Traitors were executed, their bodies left as warnings. Rivals who dared to challenge him were met with waves of violence. El Chapo's rule was not built on friendship, it was built on fear. Despite the bloodshed, Guzmán continued expanding his cartel. He forged new alliances, particularly with Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who would prove to be his most enduring partner. Unlike Palma or other hot-headed figures, El Mayo was calm, calculating, and patient. Together, Guzmán and Zambada built the Sinaloa Cartel into a resilient and adaptable organization. While other cartels fractured under pressure, Sinaloa endured, sustained by its flexible structure and its leaders' ability to delegate power to trusted lieutenants. Guzmán, though ruthless, was pragmatic. He knew he could not control everything alone. By empowering his partners while keeping final authority, he built a cartel that could survive arrests, betrayals, and even his own absence. The mid-1990s also saw Guzmán strengthen ties with Colombian suppliers. After the fall of Pablo Escobar in 1993, Colombian cartels shifted their strategy, relying more heavily on Mexican traffickers to move cocaine into the United States. Instead of demanding cash payments, Colombians began giving Mexican cartels a share of the product. For Guzmán, this was transformative. No longer just a transporter, he now controlled large amounts of cocaine himself, multiplying his profits. The shift elevated the Sinaloa Cartel from a regional organization to a global player. But with wealth and power came paranoia. Guzmán's lifestyle, though luxurious, was marked by constant fear of betrayal. He moved from house to house, often escaping through hidden tunnels or false walls. His circle of trust grew smaller, limited to family members and a few loyal associates. Yet even within his family, betrayals lurked. Relatives were arrested, others cooperated with authorities, and some were killed by rivals. The higher he climbed, the lonelier the summit became. The violence of this era scarred Mexico deeply. Entire cities lived under the shadow of cartel wars. Journalists who reported too closely on cartel activities were silenced. Police officers who refused bribes were murdered. Ordinary citizens lived in fear of stray bullets, kidnappings, and extortion. The murder of the cardinal had been a turning point, but the violence that followed proved that the state was unable or unwilling to stop the cartels. Guzmán thrived in this environment, using corruption and terror to strengthen his empire. By the late 1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel had survived assassination attempts, betrayals, and international condemnation. El Chapo had proven himself not only as a logistics genius, but also as a master of survival. He had outlasted rivals and rebuilt after betrayals. His organization was now one of the most powerful in Mexico, with influence stretching across continents. Yet his very success made him a target like never before. The United States demanded his capture, and the Mexican government, humiliated by his defiance, was determined to deliver. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would see El Chapo behind bars, plotting one of the most daring escapes in criminal history. By the early 1990s, Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán Lora had become one of the most wanted men in Mexico. The murder of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo in 1993 had placed him under the harsh glare of both Mexican and U.S. authorities. He was no longer just another trafficker operating in the shadows. He was the face of cartel violence, the outlaw whose very name ignited fear and outrage. For El Chapo, survival meant constant movement, safe houses, tunnels, bodyguards, and bribes. Yet even his cunning could not keep him free forever. In 1993, his first major downfall arrived, setting the stage for a story of capture, imprisonment, and one of the most legendary escapes in the history of organized crime. On June 9, 1993, El Chapo was finally arrested in Guatemala. After fleeing Mexico in the wake of the Cardinal's assassination, he had sought refuge across the southern border, confident that his wealth and connections would protect him. But international pressure left Guatemala with little choice. Acting on intelligence provided by Mexican authorities, Guatemalan police cornered Guzmán near the border town of Tapachula. He was quickly extradited back to Mexico, paraded before cameras as the state's prize catch. For a government accused of corruption and weakness, capturing El Chapo was a rare moment of triumph. Guzmán was sent to the Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, better known as Puente Grande Prison in Jalisco. Puente Grande was considered one of Mexico's highest security facilities, a fortress meant to hold the most dangerous criminals. But for El Chapo, prison was less a punishment than an inconvenience. From the moment he entered Puente Grande, he began transforming it into the nerve center of his empire. Guards were bribed, officials were bought, and privileges were granted. Inside those walls, El Chapo lived more like a king than a convict. Accounts from prison staff later revealed the extraordinary extent of his influence. Guzmán had access to cell phones, allowing him to continue managing cartel operations. He received visitors with ease, including prostitutes, politicians, and business associates. He held elaborate parties, complete with alcohol and music, while guards turned a blind eye. His cell was stocked with luxuries unheard of for ordinary inmates. Food, televisions, and comforts purchased with cash. He even roamed parts of the prison freely, treating Puente Grande less as a cage and more as an office. While enjoying his semi-freedom inside, Guzmán continued expanding his empire outside. His trusted partner, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and other lieutenants ensured that the Sinaloa Cartel not only survived but thrived during his incarceration. Smuggling routes multiplied, profits soared, and rivals were kept at bay. It was a reminder of El Chapo's organizational genius even behind bars. He remained one of the most powerful men in Mexico. Yet for all his privileges, Guzmán was not content with being locked away. His paranoia gnawed at him. He feared extradition to the United States, where prison walls were less porous and bribes less effective. Rumors circulated that U.S. authorities were preparing formal requests for his transfer. For El Chapo, extradition meant the end of his empire. If he was to remain a king, he had to escape. The plan took years to develop. Guzmán carefully built a network of loyal prison staff, offering bribes and favors that bound them to him. Guards, cooks, laundry workers, and even high-ranking officials became part of his scheme. Some were motivated by greed, others by fear. Over time, Puente Grande itself became compromised, its staff operating under the shadow of El Chapo's influence. His power had turned the prison into his playground, but now it would become his gateway to freedom. On January 19, 2001, Guzmán made his move. The official version of events remains shrouded in mystery, but the most widely accepted account is almost unbelievable in its simplicity. After orchestrating distractions and ensuring that the right guards were on duty, Guzmán climbed into a laundry cart pushed by an accomplice. Hidden under sheets and dirty clothes, the most wanted man in Mexico was wheeled past security checkpoints, past guards who either looked away or were paid to see nothing. The cart was rolled out of the prison, loaded onto a waiting vehicle, and driven into the night. El Chapo was free. The escape humiliated the Mexican government. Puente Grande, supposedly a high-security fortress, had been exposed as a house of corruption. Officials scrambled to explain how one of the world's most notorious criminals had simply vanished under their watch. For ordinary Mexicans, the escape was both infuriating and unsurprising. It reinforced what many already believed, that money, not justice, ruled the country. For the United States, the escape was a diplomatic disaster, proof that Mexico could not be trusted to hold its most dangerous trafficker. For Guzmán, the escape was more than just freedom. It was rebirth. He emerged from hiding not as a fugitive weakened by years in prison, but as a legend. Stories of his daring escape spread across Mexico, fueling his myth as a man who could not be contained. Folk songs, known as narco corridos, celebrated his cunning. To his enemies, the escape was a chilling reminder that El Chapo was unstoppable. To his allies, it was proof that their leader was destined to rule. But freedom came at a cost. The Sinaloa Cartel faced fierce challenges during the early 2000s as rivals sought to exploit Guzmán's absence and capture. The Arellano Felix brothers in Tijuana, the Juarez Cartel under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and later Los Zetas, all posed threats. Guzmán responded with characteristic ruthlessness. Violence escalated across Mexico, turning cities into war zones. The bloodshed marked the beginning of a new era in Mexico's drug war, one in which El Chapo would play the central role. In the years that followed his escape, Guzmán rebuilt and expanded his empire. He tightened his grip on smuggling routes, strengthened alliances, and eliminated rivals. His ability to evade capture became legendary, with authorities chasing him through mountains, jungles, and cities, only to find that he had slipped away once again. Each escape deepened his myth, transforming him from a trafficker into a symbol of both defiance and corruption. The laundry cart escape of 2001 remains one of the most audacious prison breaks in modern history. It revealed the depth of El Chapo's influence, the weakness of Mexican institutions, and the extraordinary lengths to which he would go to preserve his freedom. For Guzmán, it was not just about survival. It was about power, reputation, and destiny. He had been captured once, humiliated before the world. But now, he was free again, ready to reclaim his throne as the most powerful drug lord in Mexico. The king had escaped his cage, and the world would soon feel the consequences. When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán slipped out of Puente Grande prison in January 2001, hidden in a laundry cart, he re-entered a world that was both familiar and transformed. He had been absent from the streets for nearly 8 years, but his legend had only grown during that time. His escape shocked governments, humiliated Mexico's leadership, and electrified his followers. For the people of Sinaloa, El Chapo became more than just a man. He was now a living myth, the outlaw who defied cages and the state itself. But freedom was not enough for Guzmán. He did not intend to simply vanish into the mountains. He had returned to reclaim and then expand. His empire? The king was back, and he would stop at nothing to rule again. The early 2000s in Mexico were marked by a shifting balance of power in the drug trade. The old guard was weakening. The Tijuana Cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers, was losing ground after the arrests and deaths of key leaders. The Juarez Cartel, once commanded by Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, was fractured following his mysterious death during plastic surgery in 1997. Meanwhile, a new and terrifying force was rising. Los Zetas, former military commandos who had defected to become the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel. Ruthless, disciplined, and heavily armed, Los Zetas redefined cartel warfare. Into this volatile landscape stepped El Chapo, a man determined not only to survive but to dominate. From his base in the rugged mountains of Sinaloa, Guzmán rebuilt his organization with extraordinary speed. He solidified his alliance with Ismael El Mayo Zambada, whose calm intelligence and diplomatic skills perfectly complemented El Chapo's bold aggression. Together, they reshaped the Sinaloa Cartel into a federation, a loose but powerful alliance of traffickers and regional bosses. This structure gave the cartel remarkable resilience. Unlike rivals who concentrated power in a single family or leader, Sinaloa could adapt, absorb shocks, and keep operating even when individual bosses were captured or killed. It was, in many ways, Guzmán's greatest innovation. Under his renewed leadership, the cartel's smuggling operations grew more sophisticated than ever. Tunnels remained his signature method, and each new one seemed more elaborate than the last. Engineers designed underground passages with ventilation systems, rail tracks, and electric lighting, allowing tons of drugs to move beneath the U.S.-Mexico border undetected. But tunnels were just one part of his arsenal. Guzmán also relied on fleets of trucks, planes, and even submarines to transport cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana. His genius lay in logistics. No matter how heavily the border was policed, he always found another route, another method, another way forward. The profits were staggering. By the mid-2000s, Guzmán's Sinaloa Cartel was generating billions of dollars annually. Fortune magazine would later rank him among the richest men in the world, a shadowy figure whose fortune rivaled legitimate billionaires. But with wealth came violence. Guzmán understood that power was maintained not only through money, but also through fear. As he expanded into new territories, he unleashed brutal campaigns against rivals. Killings multiplied in Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, and other border cities, where control of smuggling corridors meant life or death for cartels. El Chapo's forces left mutilated bodies hanging from bridges, mass graves in deserts, and chilling messages scrawled on walls. It was a language of terror meant to crush resistance and intimidate all who opposed him. Yet Guzmán also cultivated an image of a folk hero. In the mountains of Sinaloa, he was seen as a benefactor, a man who provided jobs, paid for community projects, and helped the poor. Narco corridos, folk ballads glorifying drug lords, celebrated his cunning, bravery, and generosity. Songs praised him as a Robin Hood figure who stood against the government and shared his wealth with the people. For many in impoverished regions, El Chapo represented not a villain but a protector, someone who gave them dignity in a world that ignored their suffering. This duality, ruthless killer to some, benevolent savior to others, was central to his myth. His return also reignited old rivalries. The Arellano F.A. Licks brothers of Tijuana declared war, leading to vicious battles along the Baja California border. In Ciudad Juárez, Guzmán's forces clashed with the Juárez cartel, turning the city into one of the most violent places on earth. Meanwhile, his war with Los Zetas introduced a new level of savagery as both sides competed with increasingly shocking acts of brutality. For the Mexican government, these conflicts escalated into a national crisis. By the mid-2000s, the drug war had spiraled into chaos, claiming tens of thousands of lives and destabilizing entire regions. Despite the violence, El Chapo continued to evade capture. Rumors of his whereabouts swirled constantly. He was spotted in safe houses, ranches, and even public restaurants, where witnesses claimed he would dine openly, protected by dozens of armed bodyguards. Each time authorities closed in, he slipped away, aided by networks of informants, corrupt officials, and loyal communities. Stories spread of him escaping military raids by disappearing into tunnels, or of convoys of SUVs shielding him as he moved through mountain roads. He became a phantom, always just out of reach, his legend growing with each escape. Internationally, Guzmán expanded the Sinaloa Cartel's reach. His organization forged ties with Colombian suppliers, European distributors, and even Asian methamphetamine producers. By 2005, the cartel had established a truly global network, with drugs flowing to the United States, Europe, Africa, and beyond. El Chapo was no longer just Mexico's most powerful trafficker. He was a global drug lord, his influence stretching across continents. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, identified him as their top target, describing him as the most significant drug trafficker of his generation. But power came at a personal cost. Guzmán's family life was complicated and dangerous. He married multiple times and fathered numerous children, some of whom would later follow him into the drug trade. His relationships were often shadowed by betrayal, tragedy, and violence. Relatives were targeted by rivals, arrested by authorities, or killed in clashes. Yet El Chapo seemed untouchable, shielded by layers of security and an almost supernatural ability to evade the law. His confidence grew, and with it, his willingness to take risks. By the late 2000s, El Chapo Guzmán was at the height of his power. He had returned from prison not as a weakened fugitive, but as the undisputed king of Mexico's underworld. His cartel controlled vast territories, commanded armies of gunmen, and generated unimaginable wealth. Governments hunted him, rivals feared him, and entire communities revered him. He had turned his escape into a symbol of invincibility, and his empire into the most dominant force in the drug trade. The king had not only returned, he had built a kingdom larger and more powerful than ever before. Yet even at the peak of his reign, shadows gathered on the horizon. The violence unleashed by his cartel was drawing unprecedented attention from the Mexican government and international forces. The United States demanded his capture, pressuring Mexico to act decisively. And while El Chapo believed himself untouchable, history had already shown that even the most powerful drug lords eventually fell. The legend of the Tunnel Master was about to face its greatest test. By the late 2000s, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán Loera had transformed from a cunning trafficker into a figure of global infamy. He was no longer just a Mexican drug lord controlling smuggling routes across the U.S. border. He was a businessman of the underworld, the architect of a global empire that touched every continent, every major market, and every imaginable form of illicit trade. El Chapo's reach extended far beyond the mountains of Sinaloa, beyond the streets of Mexico's border cities, beyond even the United States. His name became a symbol, his story a myth, and his power unmatched in the world of organized crime. At the center of Guzmán's empire was cocaine. By forging strong partnerships with Colombian producers after the fall of Pablo Escobar, El Chapo had secured a steady supply of the world's most profitable drug. But unlike traffickers of earlier generations, he was not content to merely transport cocaine into the United States. He expanded into Europe, where prices were higher, and into Asia, where demand was growing rapidly. Shipments traveled across the Atlantic hidden in cargo containers, moved through African ports, and reached cities like Madrid, London, and Shanghai. Guzmán understood the global nature of the drug trade, and he mastered it. Heroin became another cornerstone of his empire. The rugged mountains of Sinaloa were ideal for opium poppy cultivation, and Guzmán capitalized on this advantage. As the opioid crisis grew in the United States, fueled by prescription painkillers, El Chapo's heroin filled the gaps. Black tar heroin, cheap and potent, flooded American cities. Families across the United States suffered as overdoses climbed, and behind much of that suffering stood the Sinaloa Cartel. For Guzmán, addiction in foreign countries was not tragedy, it was profit. Then came methamphetamine. Unlike cocaine and heroin, meth could be produced in massive quantities without reliance on foreign crops. Guzmán oversaw super labs capable of manufacturing tons of crystal meth each month. Precursors were imported from Asia, particularly China and India, and processed in Mexico before being smuggled north. Methamphetamine became one of the cartel's most lucrative products, cheaper to produce than cocaine and devastatingly addictive. By diversifying across cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and meth, El Chapo ensured his empire could survive shifts in demand, supply shortages, or law enforcement crackdowns. But Guzmán was more than a trafficker of drugs. He was a logistics genius. His tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border became legendary, with some stretching hundreds of feet, equipped with rail carts, lighting, and air systems. They were engineering marvels, testaments to his obsession with efficiency and secrecy. Beyond tunnels, he used fleets of trucks disguised with hidden compartments, private jets with concealed cargo, fishing boats packed with product, and even semi-submersibles gliding under the ocean's surface. His philosophy was simple: no matter how tight the border, there was always a way through. If one road closed, he opened another. The profits were staggering. By the late 2000s, estimates placed El Chapo's net worth in the billions. In 2009, Forbes magazine ranked him on its list of the world's most powerful people, placing him alongside presidents, CEOs, and royalty. In 2011, he appeared on the magazine's billionaire list, proof of just how deeply the Sinaloa Cartel had penetrated global markets. Yet, unlike other billionaires, Guzmán operated in the shadows, his fortune built on blood and secrecy. His inclusion on such lists only fed his myth. The poor boy from Sinaloa, who had risen to become one of the richest men on earth. But El Chapo's empire was not sustained by money alone. It was sustained by fear. The violence unleashed by the Sinaloa Cartel scarred Mexico deeply. Battles with rivals turned cities into war zones. In Ciudad Juárez, once a bustling industrial hub, daily murders became routine as the Sinaloa Cartel clashed with the Juárez Cartel. In Tijuana, bodies hung from bridges as warnings to rivals. Across the country, mass graves filled with victims of cartel violence. Police officers were assassinated, journalists silenced, politicians bought or killed. Guzmán ruled not only with wealth but with terror, ensuring that betrayal was rare and opposition costly. Yet even amid such brutality, his legend as a folk hero grew. In rural communities of Sinaloa, he was remembered for handing out cash, building soccer fields, and helping the poor. Narco corridos glorified his name, turning his life into song. For some, he represented defiance against a corrupt government and a system that ignored the poor. For others, he was a symbol of hope, a man who had beaten the odds and risen from nothing. The myth of El Chapo was complex, built on equal parts fear, admiration, and resentment. He was loved and hated, respected and despised, but above all, he was remembered. Internationally, Guzmán became a target of unprecedented importance. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration labeled him the most dangerous man in the world, and the number one drug threat to the United States. Law enforcement agencies across multiple continents hunted his operations, seizing shipments and dismantling networks. Yet time and again, Guzmán adapted, replacing lost routes, finding new partners, and staying one step ahead. His ability to evade capture became legendary. Raids on his safe houses revealed tunnels with trap doors, escape hatches, and secret passageways leading into the mountains. Each time authorities thought they had him cornered, he vanished. Behind the myth, however, cracks were forming. His enemies were multiplying. Los Zetas grew stronger, their military training making them formidable foes. The Gulf Cartel sought to reclaim lost ground. Even within the Sinaloa Federation, tensions simmered as lieutenants grew ambitious. Meanwhile, pressure from the United States mounted. Washington demanded that Mexico prioritize Guzmán's capture, seeing his empire as the central artery of the drug trade flowing into American cities. The Mexican government, embarrassed by his 2001 escape, was determined not to let him slip away again. Despite the looming threats, El Chapo pressed forward, driven by ambition and paranoia. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, moved constantly between safe houses, and relied on tunnels and convoys for protection. His family became both his shield and his weakness. He married Emma Coronel, a young beauty queen, and fathered twin daughters with her. His sons, known as Los Chapitos, entered the business, eager to prove themselves worthy of their father's empire. But family ties also brought danger. Rivals targeted them, law enforcement tracked them, and betrayals emerged from within. By 2010, El Chapo stood at the pinnacle of power. His cartel was the largest in Mexico, his wealth measured in billions, his legend immortalized in song and story. He was the tunnel master, the billionaire outlaw, the untouchable king of the drug trade. To his enemies, he was a shadow of death. To his allies, a godfather. To the world, a symbol of Mexico's endless struggle with corruption, violence, and the insatiable demand for drugs. His global empire was unmatched, and his myth only grew stronger with each year he remained free. But history had already shown that no king rules forever. Pablo Escobar had fallen, Amado Carrillo Fuentes had died, and the Arellano Felix brothers had crumbled. Power in the drug trade was fleeting, always vulnerable to betrayal, arrest, or death. El Chapo believed himself different, smarter, tougher, luckier. Yet the forces gathering against him were unlike anything he had faced before. The legend of the tunnel master was about to face its greatest trials as the world closed in on him once more. By the early 2010s, Joaquín Chapo Guzmán was a man who seemed to exist outside the grasp of law and order. For over a decade since his daring 2001 escape, he had evaded capture, outmaneuvering governments, rivals, and international law enforcement. His cartel stretched across continents, his wealth measured in billions, and his myth solidified in both fear and admiration. Yet even legends cannot run forever. The world was changing, and with it, the hunt for El Chapo entered a new and relentless phase. For the United States, Guzmán was not merely another trafficker. He was the trafficker. DEA agents described him as the single greatest drug lord alive, a man whose organization supplied the majority of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine flowing into American cities. Washington pressured Mexico constantly, demanding action. High-ranking U.S. officials framed Guzmán as a national security threat, an outlaw whose power rivaled that of terrorists. Every ton of cocaine seized, every meth lab dismantled, seemed to lead back to him. To capture El Chapo was no longer just law enforcement. It was political necessity. In Mexico, the war on drugs had escalated into a full-scale national crisis. When President Felipe Calderón took office in 2006, he declared war on the cartels, deploying tens of thousands of soldiers into the streets. His government aimed to restore control, but instead, the violence exploded. As the army clashed with cartels, the death toll soared. By 2012, more than 60,000 people had been killed in drug-related violence. And at the center of it all, still free, still untouchable, was El Chapo. His name became synonymous with the state's inability to protect its citizens, a living reminder of corruption and weakness. The hunt for Guzmán became increasingly sophisticated. Joint operations between the DEA, U.S. Marshals, and Mexican Marines intensified. Intelligence sharing improved, drones monitored mountain ranges, and satellites tracked suspected convoys. Each operation seemed to bring them closer. Yet Guzmán always escaped. Raids on safe houses revealed tunnels beneath bathtubs, doors leading into sewer systems, and hidden passageways connecting entire neighborhoods. In one infamous incident, Marines stormed a house in Culiacan only to find a hole in the floor and a tunnel leading directly into the city's drainage system. By the time they emerged, El Chapo was gone. The myth of his invincibility grew. Witnesses claimed he would sometimes sit in restaurants, surrounded by bodyguards, paying everyone's bill before disappearing into the night. In Sinaloa, he was said to move openly, protected by entire villages loyal to him. Some saw him as a benefactor, others as a necessary evil, but few dared betray him. His network of informants was vast, stretching from farmers in the mountains to police officers, soldiers, and politicians. Whenever authorities planned a raid, word reached El Chapo before the first helicopter took off. He was not just evading capture. He was outsmarting an entire system. Yet cracks were beginning to show. The endless violence unleashed by the cartels had forced Mexico's government to intensify its efforts. International pressure mounted as bodies piled up in Ciudad Juarez, Monterrey, and Acapulco. Every massacre, every mass grave, every atrocity was linked, directly or indirectly, to the power struggles fueled by Guzmán's empire. The world demanded results. For El Chapo himself, the pressure brought paranoia. He moved constantly, never staying in one safe house more than a few days. His wives and children became targets for surveillance. Every meal, every meeting, every movement was carefully calculated. He was still powerful, but his freedom had become a cage of fear. He trusted fewer people, relying only on a small circle of family and longtime allies. Even then, betrayals loomed. The higher the stakes, the greater the temptation for those around him to sell him out for money or immunity. In 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto became president of Mexico. He promised to shift focus from the military, heavy strategies of his predecessor. But international expectations left him little choice. Capturing El Chapo became his administration's top priority. The DEA intensified its cooperation, pouring resources into tracking Guzmán. Every intercepted phone call, every seized laptop, every whisper of information was analyzed. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The breakthrough came not through flashy intelligence, but through patience. U.S. and Mexican investigators traced communications between Guzmán's couriers and his inner circle. They learned his habits, mapped his movements, and identified his safe houses. He was most vulnerable not in the mountains, but in urban areas where his reliance on tunnels and safe houses was most visible. The hunters were closing in. Still, El Chapo's escapes remained legendary. In 2012, Marines raided a house in Los Cabos, Baja California, after receiving intelligence that he was inside. But once again, they were too late. Guzmán had slipped away hours before, leaving behind clothing, weapons, and traces of his presence. Each close call only deepened his mystique, the man who could never be caught. But time was no longer on his side. The violence consuming Mexico had turned public opinion against him. Where once he was seen as a folk hero, many now viewed him as the source of endless bloodshed. The government, desperate to restore credibility, would stop at nothing to capture him. And the United States, increasingly concerned about cartel infiltration on its own soil, pushed harder than ever. By 2014, the news had tightened. Guzmán was moving between safe houses in Culiacán, connected by underground tunnels. He had evaded dozens of raids, but each escape left him with fewer options. His paranoia deepened. He trusted only his closest aides, relying on family members to deliver messages and money. Still, the pressure was unrelenting. On February 26, 2014, after years of pursuit, the hunt finally ended. Acting on U.S. intelligence, Mexican Marines launched a raid in Mazatlán, a resort city on the Pacific coast. Guzmán was asleep in a modest condominium when the Marines stormed in. There were no tunnels this time, no escape hatches, no last-minute vanishing act. The king of tunnels, the master of escapes, was captured without a single shot fired. After 13 years on the run, El Chapo was once again in custody. The arrest was hailed as a triumph. The Mexican government presented Guzmán to the cameras, parading him in handcuffs before the world. The United States praised Mexico's cooperation, calling the capture a historic victory in the war on drugs. For ordinary Mexicans, it was a moment of both relief and skepticism. They had seen this before, El Chapo in custody, only for him to escape again. Could the state really hold him this time? For El Chapo himself, the capture was both a humiliation and a challenge. He had built a myth of invincibility, of a man who could never be caught. Now, once again, he was behind bars. But if history had shown anything, it was that Joaquín Guzmán Loera was never truly finished. The hunt might have ended, but another story was already beginning. One that would test the limits of his cunning, his influence, and his will to remain free. The capture of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán in February 2014 was celebrated as one of the greatest victories in the history of Mexico's war on drugs. After more than a decade on the run, the man who had become a global symbol of narco power was once again in custody. But for those who knew his story, there was a lingering question: could Mexico really hold him this time? History had already shown that walls, bars, and guards were never enough to contain El Chapo. And soon, the world would learn that the legend of his escapes was far from over. At first, his imprisonment seemed secure. He was sent to the high security Altiplano prison near Mexico City, the same facility that had housed notorious cartel leaders before him. The government assured the public that precautions were being taken to ensure Guzmán could never flee again. Surveillance was constant. Guards were rotated, and technology monitored his every movement. Yet El Chapo's reputation made him both prisoner and prize. To his followers, he remained a figure of admiration; to his enemies, a target. And to his own organization, he was still the boss. Inside prison walls, Guzmán appeared calm and confident. He spent time with his lawyers, plotted strategies, and maintained contact with his family. But behind the scenes, plans were already in motion. For El Chapo, captivity was never permanent. The man who had slipped through tunnels, sewers, and guarded borders was already envisioning his next escape. On July 11, 2015, that vision became reality. In an event that shocked the world, El Chapo disappeared from his cell. Surveillance cameras captured him pacing, bending down to his shower area, and then vanishing. When guards entered, the cell was empty. Below the shower floor, a hole had been dug, leading to a tunnel nearly a mile long, complete with ventilation, lighting, and even a modified motorcycle on rails. The tunnel ended in a construction site outside the prison walls. It was an engineering marvel, a feat of precision and daring that only El Chapo could command. The escape humiliated the Mexican government. How could the most wanted man in the world vanish from a supposedly secure facility? The answer, many suspected, lay in corruption. It was impossible for such a tunnel to be built without help from inside. Rumors swirled of guards paid off, officials bribed, and an entire system compromised by El Chapo's billions. Once again, Guzmán had proven that money and power could bend the rules of reality itself. For months after his escape, he remained hidden, moving between safe houses and mountain hideouts. But his freedom came at a cost. The manhunt intensified, with U.S. and Mexican forces working together more aggressively than ever. Every phone call, every courier, every movement was scrutinized. Still, Guzmán remained elusive. His ability to vanish had become legendary, but his luck was beginning to run thin. In January 2016, his downfall came from an unexpected source: Hollywood. Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo and American actor Sean Penn had arranged a secret meeting with Guzmán for an interview. Though the meeting was intended to tell his story, it inadvertently revealed his location. Mexican Marines tracked his movements, launching a raid on a safe house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. The firefight was intense, with Guzmán narrowly escaping through tunnels once again. But this time, The Marines were ready. He was intercepted on a nearby highway and captured after a brief chase. The world's most infamous drug lord was back in custody. This time there would be no mistakes. Mexican officials, under immense pressure, approved his extradition to the United States. For years, Guzmán had resisted the idea, knowing that U.S. prisons were far more difficult to escape. But in January 2017, his fate was sealed. El Chapo was placed on a plane and flown to New York City, where he would face trial in a federal court. The trial of Joaquín Guzmán Loera, held in Brooklyn, was one of the most closely watched in U.S. history. Security was unprecedented. Snipers on rooftops, helicopters circling, and heavily armed marshals escorting him at every step. Inside the courtroom, Guzmán sat quietly, dressed in a suit, as prosecutors laid out the case against him. Witness after witness described the staggering scale of his empire. Billions of dollars in drugs smuggled across borders, networks of assassins, and corruption reaching the highest levels of government. Former cartel lieutenants testified in detail, painting a portrait of a man both ruthless and brilliant. The defense argued that Guzmán was a scapegoat, that the real power of the cartel rested with others. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photos, recordings, intercepted messages, all pointed to El Chapo as the mastermind of a criminal network unparalleled in modern times. In February 2019, after a 3-month trial, the verdict was delivered. Joaquín Guzmán was found guilty on all counts, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized crime. The judge sentenced him to life in prison plus 30 years. For a man who had escaped countless times, there would be no escape this time. El Chapo was sent to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known simply as ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America. Designed to hold the nation's most dangerous criminals, it is a fortress of concrete and steel. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, with meals passed through small slots and limited human contact. For Guzmán, who once commanded armies of men and ruled an empire, his world shrank to a cell no larger than a bathroom. There, in silence and isolation, the legend of El Chapo entered its final chapter. His influence on the outside world diminished, though the Sinaloa Cartel continued to thrive under new leadership, particularly his sons, known as Los Chapitos. The empire he built did not collapse with his capture. It adapted, proving that cartels are not just about individuals, but entire systems fueled by demand, corruption, and violence. Today, Joaquín Guzmán sits in ADX Florence, cut off from the world he once dominated. His story has become part of popular culture, inspiring books, television series, and endless debates. To some, he remains a symbol of defiance, a poor boy from Sinaloa who rose to unimaginable power. To others, he is a criminal whose greed and brutality left tens of thousands dead and scarred Mexico for generations. His legacy is a paradox, a man both admired and despised, feared and mythologized. His name will forever be linked to tunnels, escapes, and the vast underworld of the drug trade. Yet in the end, even El Chapo could not escape the weight of justice. Behind the walls of America's toughest prison, the master of tunnels has nowhere left to run.